Good morning and welcome to the Fundamentals of English Language and Literature Teaching, paper number 10, semester 3 of MA English part 2. Today we are going to talk about the various psychological theories of language learning, the first being behaviorism. And under this, we'll be talking about the classical conditioning. The capacity to acquire and use language is a key aspect that distinguishes human beings from other animals. Learning is a complex process that has generated numerous interpretations and theories of how it is effectively accomplished. Learning has been defined in numerous ways by many theorists, researchers, and educational practitioners. Although universal agreement on any single definition for learning is non-existent, many definitions employ common elements. The following definition by Schuell, as interpreted by Schank in 1991, incorporates the main idea that learning is an enduring change in behavior, or in the capacity to behave in a given fashion, which results from the practice or other forms of experience. The two words that we have to bear in mind before further going into the discussion of English language teaching are acquisition and learning. Acquiring a language is a natural process as we pick up the mother tongue. Listening to the elders speaking around, then slowly speaking, followed by reading and then writing in the school and college levels. Whereas learning a language is an artificial way of learning a new language apart from your mother tongue, maybe a second language or a third language. For example, in India, in Maharashtra, the way we learn Marathi is acquiring a language. So the mother tongue is always acquired and is a very natural process of learning it. Whereas we learn Hindi as a second language and we learn English as a third language, artificially in a school and college situation. It is Kreshn who for the first time has differentiated between acquisition and learning. All the endeavors in the language teaching are to make learning an acquisition process. In spite of the fact that we learn a second language or a third language in an artificial situation like school or college, efforts and research go into making the learning of the language and acquisition of the language. The methods, the research, audiovisual aids, and various methodologies in the recent times that we adopt are to enable and make the second language acquisition process. There are a number of theories related to the language learning, like behaviorism, cognitivism, innate language hypothesis, inter-language hypothesis, error analysis, contrast analysis hypothesis, and so on, which are mostly put forwarded by the psychologists and the influence of psychology on language learning processes. Learning theories provide instructional strategies and techniques for facilitating language learning. Each theory operates under the constraints of a limited theoretical background. Educational practitioners need to familiarize themselves with important theories of learning, that is, behavioral and cognitive theories, which has implications for designing instructional activities in language teaching. This understanding provides the teachers with a comparison of these two different viewpoints and illustrates how these differences might be translated into practical applications in instructional situations. However, the task of translating learning theory and practical applications is not an easy job, as learning is a very complex phenomenon. The practitioner cannot afford to ignore any theory and might provide practical implications. So learning of all these theories of language learning is a must to enable us as teachers of English language in the Indian context to become better teachers, so that we can combine and recombine the methodologies resulting thereby and become efficient and good teachers. Linguistics and psychology are closely intertwined because language learning involves the individual learner, motivation, memory, and the actual learning process that take place in the mind of the learner. There are several schools of thought and developments in psychology, in which some may be mere hypotheses and some are established and proved theories. But the most important theories that we have to learn and bear in mind before entering into the teaching process as such are behaviorism and cognitivism. Though we shall be talking about the other hypotheses also, behaviorism and cognitivism are the essential language learning theories that we have to bear in mind as would-be teachers. Behaviorism, it is an empirical experiments on organisms and laboratory animals that resulted in the culmination of the behaviorism. The behaviorist school of psychology is based on the empirical evidence obtained from the experiments with living organisms like amoeba and laboratory animals like the dog and the pigeon. How these animals reacted to the primary drives like temperature, heat, hunger, etc. formed the base to this school of thought. The higher the organism is, the greater its possible ranges of behavior and the greater its possibilities of learning. Learning is considered to be a change of behavior patterns, and for the behaviorists, learning is an associate process, a result of what psychologists called as conditioning. The term behavior for them is interpreted in terms of a stimulus, which is represented as S, and response, which is represented as R. Language learning is a change in behavior whereupon a stimulus giving a response is learned and thereby the animal changes in its behavior. Behaviorism believes in stimulus, response and conditioning and thereby a change in behavior. Two types of conditioning can be possible in the animals as well as human beings. One is classical conditioning, which is the result of the experimentation that is done by Pavlov on dogs and amoeba, and operant conditioning, which is the result of the experimentation that is done by B.F. Skinner on pigeons. In this video, let us talk about the classical conditioning. In the following video, we shall be talking about the operant conditioning and a discussion on behaviorism as a whole. When a dog sees a piece of meat, which is the stimulus, it automatically salivates, which is the response. So there is a natural connection that is present between the meat and the salivation. If the meat is the stimulus, the salivation is the response, which is explained in point 1 of your slide. The meat becomes S1 and the dog that sees the meat automatically salivates, which becomes the response of the dog. This is a natural instinct that is present in the animals. On the contrary, when it hears a bell, for example, it does not salivate. No response is been observed at all. As you could see in point number 2 of the slide, the ringing of the bell, which is the second stimulus, S2, there is absolutely no response from the dog's side if it listens to the ringing of the bell. But the moment it sees the meat, S1, the response is salivation. But if the bell is rung every time the dog is given the meat, after some time, the dog begins to correlate between the ringing of the bell and the giving of the meat. As a result of which, the dog begins to salivate, give the response whenever it hears the bell S2, even when it is not accompanied by the meat. Thus, the dog is supposed to have learnt a new thing. Earlier, it never knew that the ringing of the bell is a stimulus to it, and it never responded. But in due course of time, when the ringing of the bell S2 is followed by the giving of the meat S1 every time, the dog has learnt a new thing. that the ringing of the bell automatically will be followed by the giving of the meat. And so even if the meat is not given in the initial times, the ringing of the bell is heard by the dog gives a response of salivation. So as you could see in point number 3 on the slide, S1 is giving of the meat, S2 is ringing of the bell. They both are together. So the dog has understood the moment S2 is given as a stimulus, that is the ringing of the bell, the dog starts salivating. So now it doesn't require the S1 or the giving of the meat. The moment it listens to the ringing of the bell S2, the dog is conditioned to respond by salivation, as you could see in point number 4 of the slide. Thus, the dog is conditioned to salivate whenever it listens to the bell. This change from one pattern of behavior to another is what the behaviorists call as conditioned learning. And this type of learning is called as the classical conditioning. These experiments were done by the Russian psychologist Pavlov. Such type of conditioning has been called as the classical conditioning. By classical conditioning, we mean that it considers an organism to be passive. S1 and S2 should always be together. Then the S1 and S2 are to be repeated many times. A new bond of learning is formed. A bond of association is formed between S1 and a new stimulus S2. When the associative bond between S1 and S2 is strong enough, S2 can itself produce the response, as we have seen in the point number 4 of the previous slide. This bond between S1 and S2 is reinforced with repetition and weakened by the absence of repetition. As a result, an established behavioral pattern called the classical conditioning is being observed, which substitutes a stimulus S1 by another called S2. So when S2 is given, that is the ringing of the bell is given, even in the initial times when the meat is not provided, that is S1 is not provided, the dog, because it is conditioned classically, starts salivating, giving the response. Learning always is reinforced through practice. And the dog is now supposed to be classically conditioned. The organism, though, plays a passive role in classical conditioning. Everything depends on the environment and external agents for the learning of whatever is being taught. This is called as behaviorism, and the classical conditioning of behaviorism has had much impact in the initial times of late 20th century and early 21st century across the world in terms of learning a language. So today, in this video, we learned what classical conditioning is based upon the experiments done by Pavlov on dog. Thank you for watching the video. Stay tuned for the next videos.